This is a question that circulates in podcasts, news reports, and academic studies, and no one seems to have the courage to answer it honestly. Where did all the men go? Not men physically, because they are still here, at work, at the gym, in traffic, at the bar with friends. But an entire generation of men has simply stopped. Stopped dating, stopped looking for relationships, stopped investing in the idea of building something with a partner. And the world looks at this with genuine perplexity, as if it were an unsolved enigma. Except it's not an enigma, it's an answer. An intelligent, calculated, and silent answer to everything these men lived, felt, and lost within relationships that should have been safe. Today, I'm going to talk about this without beating around the bush, without the diplomatic caution of someone who is afraid of the backlash. I'm going to talk about what actually happened to a generation of men, what they lived through, what it cost them, and why, after everything, millions of them silently reached the exact same conclusion. It's no longer worth trying. And before you reach for the comments section to call this bitterness or resentment, I ask you to stay until the end. What comes next is not a rant, it's a story. The story of what it's like to be a man who gave everything, his time, his vulnerability, his emotional honesty, his financial stability, and watched all of it be used, discarded, or turned against him. It's the story of what happens inside this man afterward, in the place nobody sees. I want to tell you about Marcos. Marcos was 29 years old when he met her. He was the kind of man who showed up, who remembered things, who planned a birthday dinner 3 weeks in advance. Not because anyone told him to, but because that was how he loved, with attention, with intention, with everything he had. He wasn't perfect, he would say so himself without hesitation. He had his walls, his blind spots, that specific emotional difficulty of a man raised to solve things on his own. But he was genuinely trying, with the total openness of someone who had never been seriously hurt before. The relationship lasted 4 years, and in those 4 years, Marcos learned things nobody had warned him existed. He learned that vulnerability in the wrong hands doesn't create intimacy, it creates ammunition. That the things he shared in his most honest moments, his fears, his failures, the parts of himself he had never shown anyone, could be brought back during a fight to hit exactly where it hurt the most. He learned the specific exhaustion of a man who has his feelings perpetually invalidated, whose reality is always up for debate, who can never defend his own experience convincingly enough. When the relationship ended, with justifications that changed every time he asked for clarity, Marcos didn't break down the way people expect. He went silent, and it's because of this silence that this video exists, because this silence says something, and it's time to listen to it. What happens inside a man after a relationship breaks him, and I use that word deliberately, not disappoints, not ends, breaks. It follows a path that almost no one maps out. The first thing that happens is grief. And male grief doesn't work like in the movies. It doesn't announce itself. It goes beneath the surface and becomes a weight that sits on his chest while normal life goes on, at the gym, at work, in conversations with friends who don't know how to ask and wouldn't know what to do with the answer. He carries it alone because he was taught to do exactly that. And the cost of this silent carrying is something no statistic can properly measure. The second thing that happens is the audit. A man who has been truly hurt involuntarily revisits the entire experience, trying to understand where the math went wrong. He gave this much, received that much, changed this about himself, was asked to change that, tried to repair what was breaking. And yet, it still broke. The answer that keeps coming up, the one he resists for a long time because it is deeply uncomfortable, is that the rules of the game were not the rules he was playing by. The things he believed made him a good partner, emotional availability, consistent presence, real effort, were not the things being rewarded or protected. The third thing is recalibration. And this is the part nobody talks about, because it's what leads to the definitive silence. The man who did the audit doesn't explode, he doesn't get bitter or loud, he gets strategic. He starts protecting himself, not consciously, not all at once, but gradually, the same way a person who has touched a hot surface enough times eventually stops reaching out their arm. He stops opening up so fast, stops investing so deep, stops believing with that previous total confidence that this is safe. From the outside, this looks like coldness, It looks like emotional unavailability, but on the inside, it's something else entirely. It's a man who learned in the most personal laboratory there is, his own life. If you're not subscribed to the channel yet, now is the time to subscribe and leave a like. This channel exists to have exactly this kind of conversation, the ones that aren't happening anywhere else. I want to be precise here, because precision matters. This isn't about all women. It's about specific patterns lived frequently enough that these men grew to expect them. And it's this expectation, built from repeated experiences, that is the real story. Because a man doesn't give up after one bad experience. A man gives up after the pattern repeats. After the third relationship that ends with him feeling inadequate for reasons he can't control. After the fifth time his emotional honesty was used against him. After the 10th time the goalposts moved and he discovered he was failing a test he didn't even know he was taking. It's not a woman that breaks a man, it's the pattern. The first pattern is the emotional ledger that never balances. His failures are logged and retrievable. His successes are accepted and forgotten. The dinner he forgot is remembered 6 months later in an argument. The 100 dinners he didn't forget are nowhere to be seen. A man who lives within this dynamic long enough begins to feel something he can't always name. That no matter how much he does, the account is perpetually in the negative, and there is no level of effort that produces a positive balance because the currency keeps changing. The second pattern is the vulnerability trap. An entire generation of men received the message. Open up, be vulnerable, share your feelings. And a certain kind of man, the good one, the one who is truly trying, did exactly that. He opened up, shared what he had never shared with anyone, and then discovered what happens to a man's vulnerability in the wrong hands. It gets used, not always with deliberate cruelty, but in the heat of a conflict. The things he shared in his softest moments become the things pointed at him in his hardest moments. After this happens once, twice, 3 times across different relationships, the lesson becomes permanent. He doesn't stop feeling, he stops sharing. And the wall that goes up around this decision is built so efficiently and so silently that, over time, he himself forgets what it was like not to have it. The third pattern is the moving goalpost. A man learns what his partner needs, adjusts, delivers, and then the standard subtly shifts, the bar moves. What was enough last month is insufficient this month. A man who experiences this long enough stops believing there is a version of himself that will ever be definitively enough, because, enough, he learned in practice, is not a fixed destination, it's a moving target operated by someone else. A study conducted with 2,000 British men by the Equimundo Institute showed that 62% of men believe the expectations placed on them within relationships are too high, and 44% said they would have to change too much about themselves to make a serious long-term relationship work. This isn't a statistic about lazy men. It's a statistic about men who have been in the game long enough to realize that the game, as it is set up, is impossible to win. The fourth pattern is the transactional turn. A man falls in love, sees the woman completely, and then, over time, begins to realize that his value in the relationship is not who he is, but what he provides. That the love he receives is, in some silent way, conditional on his performance in the world, his income, his ambition. And when that performance drops, when he goes through a rough patch or simply isn't at his best, he feels the temperature change. First subtly, then unmistakably. The man who lives this looks back and asks himself a question he can no longer undo. Was she in love with me, or with what I represented? The fifth pattern is being punished for the sins of other men. Arriving at a new relationship already condemned for crimes committed by others is one of the most corrosive phenomena in contemporary dating. Marcos described it like this. When I met the last woman I was serious with, I felt like I had walked into a courtroom. I hadn't done anything, I hadn't lied or cheated, but from the very first week, I felt her waiting for me to do it. And the man she was testing me against wasn't me, it was every man who had hurt her before. A woman who has been genuinely hurt carries that wound into the next relationship, and that is human and understandable. But when the wound becomes a weapon and the new man is treated as a suspect from day one, he has no way to win. He is serving time for another man's crime, and after a while, he decides he'd rather not serve any time at all. Everything we've discussed so far is personal. One man, one relationship, one wound. But this story isn't just personal, it's structural. And to understand why millions of men, not thousands, millions, have reached the same silent decision, you need to understand what the modern dating landscape has done to them at scale. Dating apps promised a revolution and delivered something else. For the majority of average men who were genuinely trying, they became the most efficient rejection machine ever built. Swipe after swipe resulting in nothing, match after match going nowhere, and the accumulated weight of hundreds of tiny rejections delivered in silence, without explanation, without context. And for the men who did get matches, who went on dates, who invested time, money, and real emotional preparation, what frequently followed was ghosting, being vanished without a word, without a reason, as if the night had never happened and the person across the table had never been real. Ghosting sounds like a small thing when you just say the word like that, but for a man who invested emotionally, who allowed himself to hope, being vanished is a specific cruelty that says, you are not worth an explanation, you have no value. Your feelings are not real enough to be acknowledged. Multiply that experience 5, 10, 15 times, and you begin to understand the arithmetic of why men stop. It's not weakness, it's math. A man can absorb a certain number of losses, but there is a different threshold for everyone, beyond which the cost of getting back up outweighs the expected return of getting up again. And when a man crosses that threshold, he doesn't fall dramatically. He simply stops getting up. He stops swiping, stops searching, and redirects the energy that used to go into relationships inward, into his work, his workouts, his deep friendships, into the things that give back what he puts in. And for many men, this redirection produces something unexpected. The life built in the absence of a relationship turns out to be genuinely good. Not a consolation prize, not a waiting room, a real life, built with intention, that doesn't need anyone else's participation to be worth living. The world looks at this and calls it quitting, the men living it call it arriving. I want to speak directly to you now. If you are watching this video, I think I know something about you. You aren't here by accident. Something in the title touched something in you, some recognition, some stored experience that made you click and stay. Maybe you are Marcos, maybe your version of his story is shorter or longer, happened 10 years ago, or is still happening right now. Maybe the wound is fresh, the kind that makes you check your phone 20 times a day waiting for a message that isn't going to come, or maybe it's old, scarred over enough to leave a mark, but sensitive enough that certain conversations press on it and remind you it's still there. Whichever version it is, I want to tell you something that this culture rarely says to men who have been hurt in relationships. What happened to you was real. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't exaggerated. The pattern you lived, the cost it extracted from you, the change it made in you was real. And the decision you made afterward, to protect yourself, to redirect your energy toward things that return what you put in, is nothing to be ashamed of. It is an intelligent response to real information gathered from real experiences. That being said, and I say this not to contradict what came before, but to add something honest, the wall you build is worth examining. Not torn down, not judged, examined. Because there is a difference between the protection that serves you and the protection that imprisons you. Between the boundary that keeps the wrong things out and the wall that keeps everything out, including the things that could be different. You are not obligated to try again, but you at least deserve the clarity of knowing what you are choosing, and choosing it with open eyes, not in the dark built by the survival instinct after pain. Marcos is 36 years old today. He lives in an apartment he designed for himself, with the books he chose, a workout routine he hasn't broken in 2 years, and a job he is genuinely proud of. He isn't bitter. He will tell you this with a clarity that is hard to dispute. He rarely talks about the relationship that changed him, not because the wound is still open, but because it has genuinely stopped being the most interesting thing in his life. And when people ask if he feels lonely, he makes a specific pause, not to formulate an answer he hasn't thought of yet, but because the question feels slightly wrong for his actual experience. Loneliness implies that what I have is not enough, and what I have is completely mine. For now, it's enough. Maybe forever, I don't know. But right now, it's enough. This isn't a man who gave up on life. It's a man who recalibrated. He gave up on a version of love that kept costing more than it offered, on patterns that repeated until he finally recognized them, on a version of himself that kept absorbing damage and calling it devotion. What he kept was everything else. His integrity, his depth, his capacity to love still present, still real, only no longer deployed without carefully considering where it is going. If your experience has any version of this story, it deserves to be seen with clarity. Not as a failure, not as a wound that never healed, not as proof that something is wrong with you, but as the honest and completely understandable answer of a man who learned from his own life and chose accordingly.